Hello, it's Duncan. I'm back as programmer for Gilded Rose after a bit of an enforced break over Christmas and New Year. So when the market lost confidence in Netflix, it wasn't at all clear that Gilded Rose could carry on. But good news, we've had a new round of funding, and it looks like my job is safe here for a while. So today we're going to get ourselves back into the code with a little bit of not refactoring, but tidying up. If you remember, when we left, we had just added the ability to save a last modified date, or rather read a last modified date from our stock list file, and that we wrote it to be backwards compatible, so that if we didn't have a last modified date in our file, it would infer one as today, basically as the current time. We used an instant for our last modified time so that it was independent of time zones. What we didn't actually do though ever was save that into our file. We had the ability to save it into the file, but in our production code we didn't do that. Now it occurs to us that we could simplify our code quite a bit if we didn't have this path of not having a last modified date. And so we can actually just go to our main file here, and once we've loaded the items, if you remember, file load items takes a default last modified here, which is now. So that will, given that our production file has no last modified date in it, that will always resolve to now, basically. But what we're going to do now then is to just save that again. So we're going to say stock dot, and we wrote save to file. Now, if we look at our stock file here with no last modified in it, and now run our main method, the code should fire up, everything will be good, and if we open our stock file again, having run up the code, we now have a last modified in there. And so if we run that in production, it will upgrade the file permanently. So what we're going to do is we're going to commit this. Well, actually, let's just run all the tests first, shall we? Just in case. They're happy. So we'll commit this as upgrade stock file by saving when loaded. And if we push that production, then our production stock file will end up with last modified in it. So we'll do that now. Ooh. And here we are, that went to production. Our production server ran up, and we have just had a little check, and the production version of this file now has a last modified. The nice thing about that is it really allows us to simplify our code. Now, if we had lots of production systems out there, we wouldn't be able to do that, but often, and as in this case, we are software people really tending one instance of an application, especially with servers. And so we had the luxury of being able to simplify our code to match just what our single production system is like. Let's go back and look at our persistence tests then. They had this load legacy file method. Well, we don't have to do that anymore because we won't have any legacy files. So we can just take that away. Check that everything is happy, and it is. And IntelliJ tells us this legacy save to is not needed, so we can delete it. Now, if that's the case, we shouldn't really need a default last modified, because there should always be one. So let's see what would happen if we try and remove that. Let's go to File, Load Items. This default last modified is passed into stock list, and it's used here. And if we don't have a last modified header, that's what we use. Now, there is a time we might not have a last modified header and still have a valid file. That's if we have a completely empty file. Let's go back and look at our tests. And we'll see that we have save and load empty. Well, that's a stock list. That's saving a stock list. But I think there is a case really here that we haven't covered, which is save and load empty. Well, load from empty file. So this one is save and load empty stock list. So if you take an empty stock list and save it, then you should get a file with the last modified and nothing else in it. But if we load from an empty file, then what we're really saying here is if we started with an empty sequence of strings and then tried to build a stock list of that, we would expect that we had an empty stock list. We had a stock list with whatever we passed in here as default last stock list. So let's just check our understanding by inlining that and passing that into there as well. And the test say our understanding was okay, was good. But if we really are loading from an empty file, then now is any time really is as good as any other for the last modified. So we could fall back on just saying any old instance, and we've got epoch, which is the beginning of time. So if we've got an empty file, instant epoch is effectively saying, well, I don't know when that was last modified. So let's go and make that true in our code, and that the reason for doing this is that it will allow us to remove this parameter here, which will make everything a little bit easier. So let's go to stock list again and say instead of this default last modified, we'll just use instant epoch in here. And now you see we have another failing test, which is that if we have no last modified header, we were hitting that path, instant epoch would be a reasonable thing to use in there. So let's just check that works. And it does. And that should mean that this default last modified is unused. And this default last modified is unused. That's all good. Interestingly, we haven't had to change our production code because our production code was using the default value of this here, which is instant now. So we've made nothing better or worse, really. That's all good. So we go back here and say just remove that again. Okay, so checking what we have. Our only changes are in persisting, which isn't a great deal simpler, but is a little bit simpler. And our tests, which we've removed a test, we've added a test, but things are a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to understand. And I think it's important that we keep our code as simple as it possibly can be. We had code in there that wouldn't actually be being hit in production, so it's good to take it out now that we can. Okay, so we'll commit this with a message. Okay, and I think that will do us for today. Just a little warm up, really, just reminding ourselves, familiarizing ourselves with the code base with a little light refactoring. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, you'll probably like the book that Nat Price and I published recently, Java to Kotlin, a refactoring guidebook. And come back soon for another episode where we will look at updating the quality of our stock as time passes.